Yo vi a Moss, primera vez que vine a Europa, él era un jovencito, su padre le autorizaba las carreras, lo vi correr en Monza y me llamó mucho la atención cómo se arrimaba a las curvas y frenaba a último momento.
Moss, in fact, was the inventor of the technique of late braking in a corner right up to the apex, a technique which would later be universally adopted by all drivers. He was a graduate of the British 500cc class of racing, brilliant and persevering at the same time. After an apprenticeship in outclassed and outdated British Grand Prix cars, he seemed destined to become #1. But he came up against Fangio, his major rival and therefore also the man with whom he would most be compared. Consequently, he would be destined to be remembered most as the uncrowned champion. Was it simply bad luck? Partially, but perhaps also because he was very independent and perhaps too nationalistic, which saw him conduct his career less well than his cars, leading to inopportune choices of team which prevented him from driving the best cars. It was the greatest shame. He had so much talent.
I was always felt as a fighter. If my car, you know, whatever happened, if I'm still running, I'm going to try and win, even if it's not impossible. You've always got this fastest lap to go to or something. And I think having that attitude, having the attitude of wanting to be a fighter, I think is a very important thing. There are things that I don't know if Fangio had them or not. He was so good, one doesn't really know whether he was a fighter or whether he wasn't.
One of Moss's greatest races was the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix, where he beat the more powerful Ferraris in his little underpowered Lotus, whose agility around the Monegasque streets he exploited to the full. Moss frequently demonstrated his brilliance and came so close to the ultimate reward of that elusive title. 3 times he finished second to Fangio and lost the title by 1 point to Hawthorn in 1958. Fangio's retirement gave Moss his best chance, but a serious accident at Goodwood meant that the title would never be his, even though he attempted a comeback.
When I went to try myself out, my lap times round the circuit were reasonable, but I could see that what had before been normal and natural to me was not. I mean, I go into a corner and suddenly think, my God, I must brake now. I must get over here. I had to work out what I had to do, whereas before it had all been natural. And I felt it was unrealistic to continue.
It was more the way they conducted their careers than the way they drove that marked the difference between Moss and Fangio. Apart from being extraordinarily talented, the Argentine was also remarkably astute. He changed teams at just the right moment, unerringly joining a team just when it was coming good. He was a protégé of Argentina's dictator Perón, who sent him to Europe in the late 40s. Fangio won his first title with Alfa Romeo in 1951, before 2 lean years without a competitive car. It was a lesson well learnt. This meagre period ended with his joining Mercedes as team leader, the German team returning to Grand Prix racing with extremely advanced machines which would outclass their rivals. Similarly, Fangio would outclass his teammates, winning his second world title easily, ahead of Ferrari drivers Gonzalez and Hawthorn. Physically, Fangio made an unlikely racing driver. He wasn't very tall, slightly plump, he spoke in a light, high voice and seemed almost reserved. But that was countered by his nose and steel blue eyes, which gave him the hungry look of an eagle. He drove with minute precision, and his mechanical background meant that he could bring home the most weary of machines. He was over 40 in 1955, but still managed to repress his new teammate Sterling Moss, 18 years his junior.
I remember going to Monte Carlo, and Fangio did a 1 whatever the lap was, and I went out just after that. I took a 10th off, and I will do it. Came in, took my gloves off. He did another 10th off mine. Then I went out, took a 10th off his, and so on. So it went on until in the end, Neubauer said, "Look, cut it out." The point is that whatever is possible, like Bannister did a 4-minute mile, he would have done a 3:59.9, and whatever you'd done, he could always do that fraction more. Fangio is without doubt the greatest driver who's ever lived. I think there are other drivers who approach him on speed, but there's never been a driver that's approached him as a complete entity of a man. I'm talking now Formula One, where he was the ultimate.
In 2 seasons with Mercedes, he won 8 out of 12 Grand Prix, plus 2 World Championships to add to his first, but the German team was pulling out of racing. He moved to Ferrari for 1956, a team that he distrusted, but which held him in high regard. The atmosphere got worse and worse during the year, but Fangio still managed to win the title, just ahead of Moss and his Maserati. Fangio was well placed to appreciate the qualities of the 250F and moved to the works team for 1957, while Moss went to Vanwall. The Argentine made the best choice, winning his 5th world title. It was during this season that he scored the greatest victory of his career. A tardy pit stop in the German Grand Prix saw him nearly 50 seconds behind the scrapping Ferrari pair Hawthorne and Collins. But on this day, Fangio was in masterly form, the Maserati flying around the sinuous Nürburgring. He not only caught the Lancia Ferraris, but overtook them and won by 3 seconds. Only a truly exceptional champion could succeed in such a gargantuan task. But this would be his 24th and final win. Once the fuss had died down, and with his 5th world title won, this 47-year-old, still clearly a force to be reckoned with, went for another championship in 1958, only to retire in mid-season.
Cuando fui a correr a Reims, mi coche primero no se mantenía bien, que era una de las particularidades más exponentes de Maserati. Entonces yo pregunto a Guarino, ¿qué pasa con el coche que no se tiene? Dijo, cambiamos los amortiguadores. Pero ¿y por qué? Si los otros andaban bien. Me dijo, no, porque estos pagan. Entonces yo me di cuenta que la cosa ya era distinto. Dije, ellos pagan, pero soy yo el que corro en el auto. Y largamos la carrera y a las 15 vueltas se rompió el pedal del embriague. Me quedé sin el embriague. Así que me paré en el box, le di el pedal, lo tenía ahí en el piso, y ellos me pidieron por favor que siguiera, me empujaron el auto y seguí. Y llegué cuarto. Yo soy un hombre que creo en el destino. Quizás me ayudó mucho la suerte y el destino. Y ya tenía más de 46 años. Ya tenía que esforzar más que los jóvenes de 20, 25, 22. Y que esa fue una decisión que tomé en ese momento y nunca me arrepentí de eso. Usted sabe que siempre está quien lo alaba, quien le dice, sos el mejor, a vos sos imbatible, y el peligro es creerse que es el mejor. Claro, así que esto, dije, es el momento oportuno para dejar las carreras.
He retired as the reigning world champion, and his remarkable record made him the racing driver of the era, the example of the perfect driver. 3 decades later, his fame and success are still legendary. In the early 60s came another legend, a man whose speed and perfection had his rivals and spectators alike gasping in admiration, Jim Clark. Clark was a driver of class. The way he came alive in a racing car, particularly at the start of a race, was symbolic of his career, meteoric.
Jim Clark was first and foremost a Scottish farmer. He really wasn't made to be a racing driver. He was introverted, he was shy, he was really a man who felt more at home on his farm, on his land, with his sheep and with his farm workers and fellow Scots.
But Clark was one of those lucky sportsmen who possessed unique natural talent. All he needed was the catalyst to draw it out of him. And that catalyst was Colin Chapman, the man behind Lotus. Together, they performed miracles. From an apprenticeship in Formula Junior, Clark went on to be the first great Formula One champion of what was then the dawning age of rear-engined cars. He outclassed his rivals with serene confidence. Throughout his career, he would remain a Lotus driver and dominated the 1963 and then 1965 World Championships.
Jim Clark was the best racing driver I ever raced against. He was so smooth, so precise. He did it so naturally. He seemed to take so little out of his car. He always seemed to be going slowly, and yet he was going very fast. If there's a driver that I modelled myself on, it would be Jim Clark.
During his relatively short but brilliant Formula One career, Jim Clark established several remarkable records which stood for many years before being either equalled or broken. He won 25 Grand Prix, one more than Fangio. Started from pole 33 times, a record only beaten by Senna a quarter of a century later. And 7 of Clark's poles were in one season, when there were only 10 races in total. Remember, it was to Lotus and Jim Clark that Ford would entrust their new Cosworth DFV V8, and Clark won with it first time out at Zandvoort in 1967. The shape of contemporary Grand Prix cars during Clark's heyday somehow seemed to match his own speed and style, particularly on the ultra-fast circuits where precision was all important. He was a master of Spa, even though he hated the place, where his 1964 race average was nearly 133 mph in a 1.5-litre car. 4 times he won in Belgium from 1962 to 1965. He was a 4-time winner in England too. Clark finished the 1967 season on a high with 2 consecutive victories in America and Mexico. The Clark, Chapman, Duckworth trio seemed invincible, a driver with style and 2 geniuses providing his equipment. Who could rival it? They seemed set for a lengthy reign, even if the driver was indicating that he would like to retire and return to his farm in Scotland. The 1967 title had gone to Denny Hulme, but there seemed every likelihood that a 3rd world title would come Clark's way. Sadly, this was not to be. On a miserable April afternoon at the perilous Hockenheim in 1968, Clark was driving in an unrewarding Formula 2 race. For no traceable reason, although probably technical, his Lotus left the road at high speed and disappeared into the unprotected forest. There, an artist perished.